The Rwanda Genocide. Presentation and narration by Allie Jones. The highlights of this presentation will discuss a brief history of Rwanda, events leading up to the genocide itself, why it is historically important, the aftermath and effects, and present-day Rwanda. Rwanda is a relatively small country located in East Central Africa. The capital of Rwanda is Kigali. The country is bordered by Uganda, Tanzania, Burundi, and Zaire. Rwanda and Burundi were under German control from 1894 to 1918. These borders were made by European colonial powers and still exist today. Rwanda became independent in 1962. When discussing the history of Rwanda and the events leading up to the genocide, it is important to note that there were three ethnic groups that occupied Rwanda. The first, and the largest group, were the Hutu. The Hutu comprised about 85% of the total population. The second group, known as the Tutsis, made up around 14% of the population. The last and very small group that made up less than 1% of the population is known as the Twas. It is believed that the Hutus were the first people to migrate to the country anywhere from the 5th to the 11th century. The Hutus are known in history for their predominantly agricultural way of living. The Tutsis are thought to have migrated to the area around the 14th century and focused mainly on raising livestock. It is also important to note that before the Europeans came over to colonize the area, the Tutsis and the Hutus' main distinction was based on cattle ownership. The people who owned the most cattle were considered to be Tutsi, and everyone else was considered to be Hutu. Once the Europeans came to the area, these two classes took on more of a racial sense. The Europeans were said to have favored the Tutsis because they looked more European due to a thinner nose, lighter skin, and taller size. Due to this favoring, the Europeans allowed only Tutsis to obtain higher education and hold positions of power. Many believe this was the root of the conflict that later turned into an event no one will soon forget. There were even identity cards depicting if the person was a Tutsi, Hutu, or Twa. This initial conflict really ignited in the early 1990s when Hutu extremists started to blame the Tutsi population for increasing social, economic, and political pressure within the country. On April 6, 1994, the president of Rwanda, Juvenal Habyarimana, was killed when the plane carrying him and the president of Burundi was shot down. Almost immediately after Habyarimana's death, Hutu extremists put their plan into action to kill all Tutsi people. The next 100 days were characterized by mass slaughter of the Tutsi people. Women were exploited, raped, and brutally punished before being murdered. While many of the Tutsi people tried to escape and hide in churches, hospitals, or schools, it seemed there was nowhere the Hutu would not seek out and kill any Tutsi person they came in contact with. Over the course of the genocide, more than 800,000 people were killed. While the majority of those killed were Tutsi, thousands of Hutu were also murdered due to their opposition of the killing campaign. In addition to those who lost their lives, an estimated 2 million people, including Tutsi and Hutu, fled the country. Considering the estimated population of Rwanda during this time was around 7.6 million, one can see the vast amount of individuals that were involved. In addition to the mass murders, the Hutu wanted to further degrade the Tutsi and did so by not allowing the corpses to be buried. The bodies were left where they fell to decompose or be eaten by rats or other animals. Many of the corpses were also thrown into rivers and lakes to symbolize sending the Tutsis back to Ethiopia, a myth of where the Tutsi originally came from. The media played a huge role in the start and continuation of the genocide by voicing hate for the Tutsis. Newspapers had been publishing the Ten Commandments for the Hutu, which basically stated that there should be no relationship whatsoever with the Tutsis. Once the genocide started, radio broadcasts announced the people to be killed and where to find them. After grueling weeks of mass murder and torture, the genocide finally came to an end when the Rwandan Patriotic Front, which was composed of military-trained Tutsi rebels, defeated the Hutu. One of the biggest questions to this day is why the rest of the world sat idly by and watched the genocide happen without intervening. While many nations rejected the idea of a genocide altogether, others refused to use any type of authority to challenge and possibly stop the assassinations of thousands of innocent people. Since the genocide, the United Nations as well as the United States have issued formal apologies to the people of Rwanda. To date, hundreds of people have been tried and sentenced to death for their acts of violence committed during the Rwanda genocide, and tens of thousands are in prison awaiting trial. Many people in Rwanda are faced with the difficulty of being forced to remember this terrible event by memorials all over the country. Others believe it is important to remember and teach future generations the concept of evil and how to say no to this type of evil. The road to recovery, both emotionally and financially, is bound to be a tough one for Rwanda. Recovery efforts have been aided to help the recovering economy. Many of the refugees who fled to avoid the genocide have moved back to Rwanda. Memorials and services for the ones who lost their lives are ever present in Rwanda. In present-day Rwanda, there is said to be no distinction of people into separate ethnic groups, meaning the days of Tutsi versus Hutu conflict are hopefully over for good.